Next, a discussion on Congress and midterm elections. You will hear from Eleanor Clift of Newsweek, Rainbow Coalition President Jesse Jackson, William Kristol of the Project for the Republican Future, former Senator and Democratic presidential nominee George McGovern, and Washington Post editor Meg Greenfield. This live discussion is moderated by Marvin Kalb. The event is part of a monthly series of public affairs programs sponsored by George Washington University and the National Press Club.
To the National Press Club and to another forum on public policy and the press. Our topic today is covering gridlock and the midterm elections. Is it only going to get worse? I'm Marvin Kalb, a visiting professor of press and public policy at the George Washington University. November 8th is the next time the American people go to the polls. And wouldn't it be just wonderful if, in their infinite wisdom, they would approve the pollsters and the pundits and many in the press wrong once again. For weeks now, we have heard that gridlock is the new and bleak definition of American democracy, and that after these midterm elections, no matter how they turn out, it will only get worse. Is it any wonder, then, that the American people have become, as they put it, cynical about their political process, about the politicians who run it, and the journalists who cover it? And can anything be done to turn this gridlock into something positive, progress, encouraging for the American people? Our panel was selected because they are all geniuses. They know the answers to all of these questions. And from right to left, as I begin the identification right now, we have Catherine Berger, political coordinator for ABC News. On my left, Eleanor Clift, columnist for Newsweek magazine, a frequent panelist on the McLaughlin Group. Meg Greenfield, editor of the editorial page of the Washington Post. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, founder of the National Rainbow Coalition, twice a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. Kevin Phillips, editor of the American Political Report. His new book is called Arrogant Capital: Washington, Wall Street, and the Frustration of American Politics. William Kristol, founder of Project for the Republican Future, once Chief of Staff to Vice President Dan Quayle. And finally, former Senator George McGovern, a visiting professor at the George Washington University. In 1972, he was the Democratic candidate for President of the United States. My opening question goes first to Senator McGovern, and I would like to ask all of you, since you're all going to be answering the same question, to keep it to less than a minute. The question is, when the midterm elections are finally over, is the gridlock that we've been talking about, that has come to define the nature of Washington's politics, is it going to be worse, better? What's your view?
Well, if I could, in this negative season, just open on a positive note, I still think the United States government is the best in the world. I'd like to put that on the record. I served in the Congress for 22 years. Every day I was there, I was proud of it, and I thought I was doing something important. I still think the Congress is the most representative legislative body around. I think we've got the best civil service in the world, the best foreign service, despite all the attacks on the bureaucracy. And I might add, I think we have the best national press corps in the world. I can say that now without suspicion, because I'm not running for anything. Now, having said that, watching this midterm elections or series of elections, I find myself wondering why many of these people want to come to Washington. They treat the national capital as though it were some kind of a cesspool. They talk about the Congress as though it were controlled by a bunch of people trying to exploit the public interest. You wonder why they want to become a member either of the Congress or live in this terrible city. I don't know what's going to happen in November. Let's assume that the pundits are right. We're going to get a further swing towards the right, and more conservative Republicans sent...
Meaning more gridlock or less?
Well, that's what I don't know. Sometimes, let's assume, from my standpoint, that the worst happens and you get a Republican House and a Republican Senate. One would think that probably means more gridlock with a moderate Democrat in the White House, but it could be the other way. If the Republican conservatives are in the majority next time, then they're responsible for the legislative agenda. Maybe they'll have less interest in gridlock and more interest in moving the legislative agenda.
Bill Kristol, what is your sense, more or less of this gridlock?
Well, I certainly wanted to begin by defending gridlock. When you have a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, gridlock is usually, in my view, a good thing. The fact is, Congress passed, I mean, we've blocked a lot of bad legislation. We passed NAFTA over...
Who's the we here?
Republicans mostly,
okay.
and responsible,
Just want to be sure of that,
and responsible Democrats, since we couldn't have done it by ourselves. You know, we passed NAFTA over considerable popular opposition, which was responsible. We're going to pass GATT at the end of this Congress in the lame duck session in the last week of November. Clinton did get his budget through. I was against it, but it went through. The crime bill, which Bill Clinton seems to think is so important, went through. The substance of gridlock turns out to be that his health care plan, the centerpiece of his presidency, collapsed because the American people didn't like it.
You think that's the only thing?
Well, there's some trivial, I mean, even the proponents of the campaign finance reform and the lobbying reform bills admit that they were trivial. What else was, what exactly, I mean, what is it we're so worried about? What should have been done? What wonderful legislation was proposed by this administration? They got welfare reform out after 17 months when there was no serious chance of moving on it in this Congress. I think the burden will be on Republicans next year to advance aggressively a conservative reform agenda to try to pass our legislation, if we have a majority in one or both houses, and then dare the president to veto it. And I think he may sign some of our legislation.
Well, he may. Matt Greenfield, what is your sense of this?
I was afraid for a minute I was going to be agreeing with Bill Kristol, but he kept going.
Always a mistake.
I think it's the situation that is in existence now is going to continue and get more so. But I think first there are a couple of caveats about this term gridlock. One is that as long as I can remember, as long as I've been in Washington, there's been something, it wasn't always called gridlock, it's called deadlock, it's called stalemate. And I think it's more the norm than the exception. The first year of a new president, or in Johnson's case, maybe the first 2 years, people kind of pass legislation and so on. And then the president loses one, and his vulnerability is apparent. This happens to most of them, and then this starts. The other caveat is, I kind of agree with Bill, that you can't judge a Congress or executive branch on a kind of simple productivity level as sort of like a Soviet factory putting out yellow shoes that exceed the quota or something. There are some bills that are terrible and should be stopped. Presidents, through the veto, through impoundment, have done this. It works both ways. It's not of itself a bad thing. However, as an editorial writer, here comes on the other hand. I think this time it is different in kind from the way it has been in the past, and that's partly because it's not really a big fight between Democrats and Republicans or a large coalition of one region against another. It's a kind of Dodge-em car gridlock because there's so little discipline among people in Congress. The party leadership is weak in Congress and outside of Congress. People have gone into business for themselves, essentially. They get their money, their publicity on their own, dealing directly with their constituents. Someone like Richard Shelby defies the president. President says, well, we'll show him, ha-ha, and we'll say it out loud, and Shelby puts it in all of his ads and wins new support. And so I don't think I don't think people are in Congress are afraid of their leadership anymore. They're afraid of the public, and they kind of pander and create expectations they can't fulfill. I don't see little reforms doing much about this, and I have a kind of Mr. McGovern position. I mean, something will come along. I don't know what it is.
Reverend Jackson, could you help us find out what it is?
Well, from my perspective, it is not so much gridlock, but hip-locked. Basically locked at the hip on vital issues. If you look at the commercials, there's a competition by both parties. Who can peddle the most hostility, the most hate, the most fear, the most polarization, and raise the most money from the same people. And thus, there's a vast body of people who are locked out, who are said to be apathetic when in fact they're alienated and angry because they see no hope. They feel no healing. For them, there is no there. And what's amazing to me about the Democrats in this sense, that there is a story to be told. It's amazing to me that one would be putting all the ad money on running away from President Clinton as a Democrat, when in fact, with 4.5 million new jobs, the most created in the last 5 years, more jobs, more children in college, more children fed, more working their way out of poverty through earned income tax credit, less inflation, less deficit, more markets. There's a story of hope to be told. There is, in fact, economic growth. Even in foreign policy, Middle East, peace is breaking out rather than war. Haiti is in recovery. South Africa is freed. Saddam Hussein is backed up from Kuwait. And yet if one looks at these commercials, you see none of that. It's all about who can lock people up the longest, the quickest, and spend the most money doing it and call it conservative. And so I think the issue is more, at this point, hip-lock than gridlock.
Thank you. Catherine Berger, from the point of view of a network looking toward the coverage of this midterm election and then trying to cover gridlock as such, what is your perspective?
I think we are going to see more of what we have seen. I would agree with Senator McGovern that just because you have two parties at opposite ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, that does not necessarily mean there's going to be gridlock. I mean, we've had major legislation passed. The Marshall Plan, the Clean Air Act of 1970, these things can happen. However, I think there's no doubt that there's going to be more Republicans in the House, moreover, and the Senate. And moreover, these are Republicans who are running against Congress and against Clinton. In addition, you have a Republican leadership that has made it clear that they feel it's their duty to hinder this president's legislative agenda. I think just given those factors, you've got a recipe for gridlock.
Eleanor Clift, do you agree with that?
Well, when you think about everybody running against the Capitol, Senator McGovern may have provided the script for the campaigns 2 years from now. If elected, I will not serve, not even go to be part of this horrible mess. There will be more Republicans for the first time since Harry Truman, and I think they're going to have to show that they can govern. And I think the pattern that Meg referred to, instead of having a new president get some successes, I think the new Republican leadership, Newt Gingrich in the House, and even if there's not a takeover, he still has veto power over anything that gets done. And I think there will be some things accomplished at first, and then 96 will be looming, and I think we will again see the pattern of let's deny this president anything he can call a victory. So I think you will see some things accomplished. When I look at the issues on the agenda, however, health care reform, probably a very narrow bill, which Robert Reischauer, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, says would be, you just did insurance reforms, it's like putting lipstick on a pig. And then you would have welfare reform, where Republicans used to say, you know, work instead of welfare. Clinton, Democrats have moved to that. Now Charles Murray is setting the outer limits of the debate, eliminate everything. So I think the issues that are out there can bring out the worst in us as a people and certainly as a governing body.
Kevin Phillips, from what I read in your latest book, you reflect a very negative view, and you feel basic things have to change. So I would assume you think that this gridlock phenomenon will continue and perhaps even worsen?
Well, let me start out, Marvin, by taking issue with your scene setting here. I think what I reflect...
It's always a good thing to do, by the way.
I think what I reflect in this is the sense that gridlock is a bad term. Gridlock suggests that there's something fairly superficial going on here that can be solved by getting a president and a Congress of the same party, or that somehow you can push a magic button and come up with a right agenda and this is going to sail through. What I suggested in Arrogant Capital is that you've got a much more substantial process underway, and that it reflects the cumulative politics of really 30-odd years. First, of the relative or totally failed presidencies of the last 7 presidents. These are periods during which we have seen scandals, deficits, inflation, wars, riots, you name it, assassinations, without any real sense that things have been turned around, except sometimes for a couple of years. Then we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years a growing sense among Americans that the United States has in some ways peaked, that we've seen our best times in terms of our role in the global economy and the broadest reach of our power internationally, and that Americans no longer expect that their children will do better than they do. And you put these two psychologies and their growth together with the increasing American sense that Washington is an alien growth in the republic, that it's been built up by these extraordinary forces of self-indulgence and affluence to the point where 7 of the highest per capita income 20 counties in the United States are in metropolitan Washington. We've seen this build up to the point of having 91,000 people who are lobbyists or engaged in supporting lobbying activities, 60,000 lawyers, 20,000 on the congressional staff, 6 times as much as in any other national legislature. And all of this has produced an overload on the system and reflects failures of portions of our institutions. When Time magazine excerpted my book, they ran 20 questions in the Times CNN poll. And I'll just cite 2 of the results. The first result that I found so striking was that people were asked, was it enough to change the faces in Washington, or did you have to change the system? 61% said change the system. Only 29% said change the faces. They asked people if we needed a third party in this country. And 8% said yes, and low 30s, no. And the idea here was basically to fight the Democrats and Republicans, amplify and dissent from their views from top to bottom. I think that the public has come around to a point where they are enormously frustrated by never having had the critical issues and approaches and historical circumstances presented in a coherent way. They are ready for various serious politics. What they will see in the next 2 years is a mess that will make them even more ready for that serious debate.
Reverend Jackson, I have the impression listening to Kevin Phillips that you and he absolutely flat out disagree. And I would just like to add, by the way, in taking on the assumption of the program, I think that it's interesting that you do that, because I would like to think that maybe people can expect progress and good things for the American people growing out of the activities in Washington, D.C. And all of the polls, and some that you didn't cite, would suggest that they don't feel that anymore. And the idea of simply saying that you want change, sure, change for the better, fine, but how do you go about doing that? And that's what I'd like to ask Reverend Jackson. If you would help us see through some of the verbiage to what is it that can be done to turn some of this around. There's an awful lot of negativism here.
Well, when you have what I call one party with 2 names hip-locked, agreeing on the same set of assumptions, they're competing for who can get the most of what both of them fundamentally agree to. Where I thought Mr. Phillips was going was that with more and more of the PAC-driven leadership competing for a small piece of pie, it leaves a great vast body of people over that 58% who don't want just a change of faces, to go from Democratic leadership to Strom Thurmond, Jesse Helms, and Orrin Hatch. It's not a change of faces, it's a change of direction. So there's no debate now over urban policy and stimulus versus where we are. There's no real debate now over 3 strikes and you're out as the way to solve the youth crisis, or 4 balls and you're on. That's all of them are for 3 strikes you're out. The fact is, if the crime is vicious enough and the person's sick enough, 1 strike is enough. But judges already have that power. And so there's no hope in how you're going to lock up the children. What about prenatal care and Head Start, ball 1? And affordable public education, ball 2, a marketable skill, ball 3, and a job, ball 4. If there's a debate between 4 balls in your own versus 3 strikes and you're out, those are struggles against indirection. Right now, everybody's into the same basic plan of pouring money down that same rat hole. And I'm convinced unless there is some distinction that is of a difference between the two, it's going to create a vacuum here, and there'll be a significant step in that vacuum.
Marvin, can I just say a point? I had occasion the last 2 or 3 weeks to be in California for a few days, in Texas and in Florida, where we have very important races going on. And for the first time this fall, I really took time to look at the commercials. And you can't do that without coming to the conclusion that the central issue those candidates are raising is which one of them will execute the largest number of people in the shortest possible time. I think Jesse's absolutely right on this, and the great issues go undiscussed. I've been concerned for years that Democrats running away from liberalism. Liberalism is the Democratic Party. We've got 2 great traditions in this country: conservatism, which I respect. No one has ever heard me denigrate the conservative tradition. And it's an important tradition, perfectly respectable. But we also have a great tradition of liberalism that goes clear back to Thomas Jefferson. And I think it's tragic that Democrats are running away from that, admittedly under a terrific pounding from their opponents. But if we would stand up and give an accounting of what we've tried to do on the economy, on medical care, on children, on education, on trade, and these other things, it's a rather constructive record. I find Democrats thinking that they're smeared if their opponent accuses them of being a liberal. I don't understand this. I don't know of any positive program now generally supported by both Republicans and Democrats that did not begin as a liberal initiative over conservative opposition. And I think before there's going to be any turnaround, the Democrats have got to quit running away from the heart of their philosophy, which is liberalism.
I remember in 1988 campaign, I think it was Governor Dukakis who finally, and with about a week or 2 to go before the election, actually acknowledged, yes, I am liberal. That is simply in support of what you said. But Eleanor Clift, why would there be on the part, in this great national debate then, why would there be concern on the part of the Democrat to acknowledge liberalism as a guiding philosophy?
I think there's plenty of pandering to the public's fear of crime, and it's an easy thing to say 3 strikes you're out, and it's very hard to explain, well, you might get some of the wrong people, and maybe it should be 1 strike you're out. So in the campaign season, people go for the rhetorical easy outs. But there is a difference between the parties. You wouldn't have had a clinic access bill signed under a Republican administration. You wouldn't have had the Brady bill or the assault weapons ban. You wouldn't have had taxes increased on the high-income earners. So there are differences, and I think what you see the Democratic Party going through is first a kind of a symbolic overhaul, because culturally they had been stereotyped with being too far out on the left, and I think they moved in on that. Second, on jobs and income, while the numbers are great for the economy, a lot of people don't feel the high-paying jobs are out there, and this administration is now faced with trying to find a way to increase investment to produce jobs, and you can't get anybody to want to spend money because they think it's spending money for the poor, and that is just, it's not a winner in the political arena,
Marvin, let me
sadly
pick
so.
up on something, because both Jesse and George have made reference to the incapacity of the Democrats to deal with economic issues and poverty issues and such. And I really think that's the case. Now, I wrote a book 4 years ago, which both of you were interested in, called The Politics of Rich and Poor. And it basically suggested that you'd had this bubble in the 1980s of speculative practices that was akin to how Republicans had done a number on themselves before, and suggested this was a big opportunity for the Democrats. Well, I believe the Democrats have picked it up superficially, but I don't believe they picked up the essence of a number of those challenges. And I don't think, do you believe that, Jesse? I don't think you believe that they have, George.
No, I don't.
And I think until they confront this, well, the Republicans aren't supposed to pick those things.
Why not?
That's their Achilles heel.
No, but why not?
It's
Isn't
not
that part of the national responsibility?
If you want conservative economic politics, that's where you go, to the Republicans. If you want liberal economic politics, progressivism, you go to the Democrats. The fact that
Kevin,
the Democrats couldn't handle these issues is part of the problem of the two-party system.
But part of the problem, I think, too, is in the use of these words, because the use of the words themselves paralyzes in our discussion. A liberal economic policy and a conservative economic policy.
It doesn't paralyze. I mean, George McGovern's absolutely right. These are two honorable traditions which have pretty clearly differing views about the appropriate size and scope of the federal government, about the appropriate role of the government in the economy, and it's healthy for the country to have a vigorous debate on those views. And I do wish more Democrats were running as George McGovern and Jesse Jackson Democrats.
Sure.
Bill Clinton, unfortunately for you guys, with all due respect, Bill Clinton thinks he won the presidency by being a, quote, new Democrat, and a lot of Democrats think they can only get elected or re-elected by seeming to be conservative on a lot of issues. You know, I think, leaving aside the merits, I do think that is their read of American public opinion, that American public opinion, rightly or wrongly, is disaffected with big government liberalism. And I do think liberalism deserves a better defense than it's getting, though.
Meg Greenfield. Meg?
I think that liberalism may deserve a better defense than it's getting, but I don't plan to give it one here. I think on the question of crime, there are barbaric and idiotic things being suggested in terms of programs to punish criminals, to catch criminals, things that won't work, things that are cruel. All that may be true. Those are proposed solutions. However, the liberal Democrats had a problem for a long time in that they were so suspicious of introducing crime as an issue in their platforms into the American political agenda. They thought it was racist merely to say it, and they didn't take account of the fact of how many African Americans, how many people of every race are victims of crime and are frightened by it. I think they wrote themselves out, and they're trying to get back in now.
See, I think that George McGovern raises something about at least honoring your tradition to its logical conclusion. Crystal, I will not back up off the fact conservatives were for slavery. The liberators were for emancipation. The conservatives were against workers organizing the unions for collective bargaining. They were with the aristocratic exploiters of workers. Two different traditions. Liberals were for a 54 Supreme Court decision to end apartheid in our country. Conservatives, in fact, were willing to protect it. Conservatives were against public accommodations bill or the right to vote. All the things that we now hold dear in foreign policy is what makes America great. Equal protection under the law, the right to collective bargaining, and the right for everybody to vote, regardless of their race, their class, their sex, their religion. This comes from the liberating tradition. And that tradition, in fact, has enough validity to be sold if salesmen have the courage of their conviction.
I think Meg Greenfield is right that liberals in the past probably didn't manifest as clear a concern about crime as they should have, but now we're going into an election where we have a president with the overwhelming help of the liberals in the Congress. This is probably the best crime bill enacted. It may not be perfect, but at least it has a series of steps in the right direction. I think the polls show that most Americans now think that maybe the Democratic Party is better on crime than the Republican Party. And still, you have this inane argument going on about the liberals selling out on crime and President Clinton being weak on crime and all those things. I think part of the problem with this hip lock that Reverend Jackson talks about is that the two parties get their money from the same sources now. These political action committees really don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, as long as you're an incumbent that they have reasonable access to. One of the congressmen was quoted here recently as saying the reason we vote the same is we're all feeding from the same trough. This suggests to me the urgent need for some kind of campaign finance reform that breaks up the problem that I think Kevin Phillips talks about so eloquently in his book, where still the most powerful special interests are in charge of both parties on many of the key issues, especially the economic issues.
I wanted to ask the question in simply who's to blame for all of this, but I think we've been discussing that in part already, but I don't want to absolve the American people of some responsibility here, because we focus, naturally, we're in Washington, you to focus on the politicians, to focus on the press. Where are the American people in all of this? They're supposed to be the source of all of the legitimacy that all of the politicians seek. Why is it that they are content with so careless an exposition, so once over lightly an exposition of very serious problems?
Well,
Go ahead.
They're not content with it. There's one authentic grassroots movement that no one in Washington likes, that genuinely came up from the American people in the last decade, and that's term limits. And whatever you think of term limits, ultimately, it is an attempt to address precisely the problem that you are concerned about, which is people have the sense that there are built-in institutional forces in Congress and in Washington that make change and responsiveness difficult. And again, maybe the analysis is faulty, but it's not. I don't think the American people are to blame. They're doing their best to grapple with a system that's awfully hard to change. And in fact, this year in the election, I think they're going to turn over a lot of seats in an attempt to change the direction of the country to one they would like more.
Strom Thurmond advocating term limits is not exactly credible.
But Bill Kristol advocating term limits is fine.
It's a little deeper than that. And I'm convinced that the American people, again, have been so transfixed by television. Too many have been reduced to spectators as opposed to activists. Much of that which we feel good about did not come from the White House or Congress down. It came from those people up. And that's the missing component in all of this. This right to collective bargaining and Social Security and public accommodations and equal protection under the law, all that really came from the people up, really not from the politicians who were hip locked down.
Catherine Berger, do you have a feeling in the coverage at ABC, representative of other networks, for example, in this respect, do you have a sense that you are picking up this theme that the Reverend Jackson just talked about? Are you covering from down below up, or are you still focused on up down?
I think we do tend to focus more on the politicians, but we also go out and we cover people. You know, we talk to people in the districts, in the states. How are you feeling? You know, why do you support this man over that woman, or this woman over that man? The sense you get is that people are really frustrated, but the term limit thing is kind of a dodgy issue, because people are frustrated, they want to throw the bums out, and yet they're given the opportunity to do that every 2 years, and they don't. You're disagreeing with me.
Look, I mean, whatever again you think of term limits, ultimately is a remedy. I like it. I know there are responsible criticisms of it. It is an intelligent judgment of the American people that the current finance laws, the current structure of the interest groups in Washington make it hard to depose incumbents, and therefore you need a structural fix to change the balance of power between incumbents and challengers. So in that respect, it shows in a certain way an amazing sophistication on the part of the American people to go to a remedy like term limits, I think.
Yeah, the term limits movement is also heavily watered by Republican interests, because there are more Democratic congressmen. It's an effort to throw the Democratic bums out. You had more than 100 freshmen last time. You've got 52 open seats this time. The average term in the House is now 10 years. What Newt Gingrich put forward is I believe, a 12-year limit, which is longer than they serve. And the impression that is left is if you have this Republican takeover, you're going to put all these young tigers in charge, like Strom Thurmond, Jesse Helms,
That's why we need
Bob
term.
Packwood.
That's why we need term limits, Eleanor.
Well, I think that they'll all be grandfathered.
The argument for term limits, no, but they shouldn't be. I mean, that's, of course, they're going to try to grandfather themselves. But again, the question was about the American people, and I just say you have to give them credit that they are trying to fix a problem which people on this panel seem to think is a real one, of a kind of interest group gridlock in Washington.
Well, in the time that we have left, which is in the neighborhood of 20 minutes or so, what can we do about this? I mean, we've all, I think, agreed that although there is some historical parallels to the current mood, You can reach back 30, 40 years and find parallels. But there is nevertheless something distinctive about what we're going through now. Maybe it has to do with television. Maybe the explosion of technology has something to do with that. It certainly affects the nature of the campaign ads. What can be done? I'd like to turn it from the negative to a more positive spin, if it's possible. What can be done in a concrete way? Senator, do you have some thoughts that you could advance?
I read a piece, I guess it was yesterday, by David Broder, in which he described a debate that had took place. I missed the debate, but it was between two candidates running for the Congress, and the sponsoring organization laid down a rule that neither candidate could mention the other one, that they had to use the entire time saying what they wanted to accomplish if they came to Congress. According to Broder, after that debate was over, and this doesn't surprise me if that's an accurate interpretation, the audience loved it, and so did the candidates, because for the first time in the campaign, they got to talk about something other than how many people they want to put in jail, or giving everybody a bazooka in the country to protect the Second Amendment. And they really got down to what it was they wanted to accomplish if they were elected to the Congress. I'd like to see more debates, period, but especially debates like that, where candidates had to concentrate on their own legislative agenda. I think it'd be a refreshing change.
Kevin Phillips, what would you argue is a very good suggestion to try to turn some of this around?
Well, I think the essential thing is to figure out ways, and I know this is a cliche, to re-empower the American people, but principally as an electorate. The secret of America's success in electoral history has been the ability to have these grassroots renewals of our political process, whether it's starting with Jefferson in 1800 and going all the way down to FDR, and in some ways that in 1968 too. But we can't seem to have them anymore, and I think one of the reasons we can't have them anymore is this enormous buildup of interest groups, money in the political process, so that you have the two parties, as was said, sharing contributors, basically. And so voting Democratic or Republican for president doesn't produce the sort of electoral revolution that it used to. And what I think probably most of us here could share to some extent would be a belief that somehow political renewal has to take advantage of the electorate, because the American electorate has a terrific history after all is said and done. And somehow if we can get more power back in their hands, first of all, I think it tends to disrupt the hip lock, as it were. Secondly, I think it would get more people back in the process. Thirdly, I think it sort of unplugs the interest groups a bit. And as people get back in the process, hopefully they'll pay more attention, they'll feel re-involved.
But forgive me, but how do you get them back in the process? What is it that you are recommending that accomplishes that specific aim?
Well, two specific recommendations then. Okay. The first would be some version of what Lamar Alexander talks about, sending Congress back to their roots. Maybe it would be to have them home for a certain portion of the year. Maybe it would be to let them vote from their districts, so that they could spend more time at home and bypass the interest groups. And then secondly, a very, very limited version of a national referendum, which is used in practically every other country in a limited way.
Eleanor Cliff, what would you say ought to be done?
Well, I think when you see what's wrong with the system, you have to follow the money. And so I think you have to dry up some of the money. And that requires not just putting limits on the special interests, and it requires the media to make some sacrifices. A lot of the money in campaigns goes for television advertising and money to television stations and media buyers. And I think we have to take back the airwaves as a country and have this built in and have limits on what people can spend. I think you have to level the playing field there.
I'm very interested. Go ahead.
Then I would like to see in journalism, there is a new phenomenon called public journalism, which doesn't require conflict in order to write a story, to have a television show. I think there is some common ground, and I think we need to begin to search that. I mean, the public is as angry at the media as they are at the politicians.
Eleanor, you cover politics all the time. Do you think one of the reasons that many Americans don't participate any longer is that they've come to the conclusion that it doesn't make much difference who wins, that there's not all that much difference in the competing agendas?
But remember, George Wallace used to say there's not a dime's worth of difference. I mean, I don't think that's true, but I think that is the perception out there. And I don't like to blame the people, because there's so much
I'm not blaming
mud.
the people.
There's so much mud flung through the air that it's
Yeah.
hard for them to follow what's really important.
That's the point I'm making. I
Yeah.
wonder if the public sees any clear choice.
Well, I think
I don't think they do.
I think part of the problem
Catherine?
is that, and we talked about this earlier, is that we in the media tend to focus much more on process now rather than policy. And anytime you see the process, it is ugly. I mean, backroom deals were in the back room for a reason because no one wants to watch that going on. And I think when people see that, they become very cynical. It's a natural part of the political process. I mean, there has to be a give and take between the two parties, but when you see it played out on a national level, I think people get very cynical, and you know, maybe we in the media should focus more on policy. But I think part of the problem really is that focus on process.
Well, one of the things that gets... Yes, Reverend Jackson.
I say that we have, I think McGovern opened up here, a great structure, our democratic structure, checks and balance, balance of power, all the right structure. There is no substitute for bold leadership, vision, and sacrifice. When you have a generation of leadership that's kind of TV fed and bred with no authentic roots to real stuff, it begins to produce its own phantom kind. I saw a debate between Charlie Rangel and his opposition in New York, and the commentator said, now, Mr. Rangel, we know your opposition has no record of achievement, has done nothing. You've been in Congress 24 years. What have you done in 30 seconds? So he raises the phantom up to the level of 24 years of service. Well, there's no there because it's superficial. There must be a debate about the implications of Murray using race to set the basis for public policy, the implications of not standing up on, say, right-to-work laws versus oppressive working conditions, or what is our plan to rebuild our cities and recover our farms versus the other point of view. And only bold leadership, it seems to me, that will mold opinion and not follow opinion polls will break us out. There is no substitute for somebody having some authenticity and some moral authority to lead. And this DLC Republican fusion politics is not that leadership we're seeking.
Marvin.
Meg Greenfield.
There's one big thing, I think, that hasn't been mentioned. I agree there are certain reforms that could happen, but most of the incremental reforms have a life of about 6 years in the Capitol, and then the inmates learn how to get through the bars, and 10 years after reform, the situation is always much worse than it was before. Look at this campaign financing stuff, and you know that's true. I also think the press has a role. I think that some part of Americans' dissatisfaction comes from our constantly not just reporting bad news, but kind of picking on everybody in sort of tawdry, small, unimportant ways, kind of reducing everybody to some indignity. But the big thing that I think needs to be addressed is not how these people, the public and the politicians, relate to each other, but what it is that is the content of the message. And I believe that at least since Lyndon Johnson said we can have the war without having to pay for it, the parties, both Democratic and Republican, have been telling people you can have it without paying for it, and people say, yeah, we want it without paying for it. I mean, it's not just Johnson, it's the Ronald Reagan scenario. It is, in my view, the original Clinton health plan, which said you can hugely expand coverage, your own care will not be diminished, and guess what? It's not going to cost anything. And I think that there is something so false in the whole exchange that it leads to more lies and more cynicism. That's what I think.
Meg, you mentioned a moment.
Given that, when the Republicans came out with this contract convention, while we are in this debt and deficit, the media did not create this, give any background on cutting taxes on those who had the capacity to pay and doubling the military budget, all of this S&L thievery business. It was almost as if that contract was like an original thought. So it's Gingrich's contract and Clinton's covenant, but there was no kind of body given to why we're in this mess we're in now.
Reverend Jackson,
that's the media's fault.
Reverend Jackson, we are talking about the media and the press, and I want to get to that, but I do want to give Mr. Crystal an opportunity to provide some positive recommendations on ways of improving the situation. Then we're going to pick up that press angle.
Well, for the first time in 40 years, elect a Republican Congress and then elect a Republican president and see if Republicans can govern. That is one thing. Republicans have not been able to govern, obviously, with the executive and legislative branches for 40 years. And let's see whether we step up to the plate on Meg's challenge and are willing to seriously take on government spending and take on entitlements. I think the party might be more ready to do that than most observers think. Then secondly, I do think we need to devolve power away from Washington back to the people. It's not just that voters see too many stories about process on network news or in the newspapers. Voters are unhappy with the substantive results of public policies. They think many liberal policies out of Washington don't work well, and I think they're right. And I think Republicans, if we get a majority, need to really embrace an aggressive sort of agenda of relimiting government that would really, I think, be good for the country and would also provide a clear debate, provide for a clear debate between the two parties.
Now, Doug, you're making it seem, just a sec, please. You're making it seem as if this is all the fault of, in shorthand, having a Democratic president, Mr. Clinton, in the White House. All of this, as Kevin Phillips said, that goes back a number of administrations.
Right, there's been a Democratic Congress for 40 years.
Okay, so that the people, also with the White House, there have been a lot of Republicans there.
Right.
So what is it that the people can do? I mean, you say devolve power out of Washington. In what specific way is that to be done?
Vote for candidates who seek to really cut the federal government and get power back to the states, localities, and families. Plus, I think citizens on their own can do much more and should do much more to take back control of their lives and to address problems locally. One of the great myths in America is that every problem is a national problem best addressed by national solutions. Crime, in fact, though we are all worried about crime, is very much of a localized problem. When you really look at crime rates, it's not spread evenly across the nation. And what we need is much more aggressive efforts by communities and by local governments to attack problems like crime. School reform, different solutions will work in different places.
But as we have behind these labels, what happens on the Reagan, the conservative, the debt and deficit increases? On the Clinton, the debt, deficit, inflation comes down. Now, who is a conservative and who is a liberal, and what does it matter? Is the issue conservatism or liberalism, or is it direction?
It's direction, conservative or liberal. I wish we had gotten the debt down under Reagan. We didn't, partly because of failures of the Reagan administration and the Republican Party, partly because of failures of the Democratic Congress. But look, Clinton's budget was different from what a Republican budget would have been.
No doubt about it.
I want to talk for a little bit. I want to talk for a little bit of time that's remaining about the role of the press, because that has come up in almost everybody's conversation here. Meg Greenfield, you've talked about it. Reverend Jackson has talked about it. Eleanor's talked about it. Senator McGovern has talked about it. What can the press do? I'm old enough to remember that the press always considered itself a fly on the wall of history. Now that is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. The press is so much part of the process now, one way or another. But is there something that the press can do? Is there a new press out there that can somehow do a better job? Can it turn some of the negatives around that you were talking about, Meg? Yes?
I don't think so. I'm sort of in favor of the fly on the wall of history theory of the press. I just think the press has to do what it should have been doing better. Be fair, be more dispassionate, and stop. It's hard to say picking on people for sort of dumb little things, but it does seem to me that you read so much in all publications, see it on television, of huge long takeouts on what are really tiny peccadillos. I'm not talking about whitewater, something like that. I'm just talking about a kind of general he thing and tearing down people. But I think basically the press just has to be more intelligent, more fair. I can't think of any rules or regulations, and I don't like the idea of more advocacy in the news columns. That's because where I work at the paper, we've got a corner on advocacy, or at least so we like to think.
Meg, there's kind of a feeling among those of us, some of us, who study the press these days from the outside rather than be part of it, that not only does it seem to be part of a political process, which it didn't feel comfortable being before, But above and beyond that, its power today, given the role of television, the cost of television, the way in which television affects a politician's sense of what is reality. We're now in a world where it's called virtual reality. And everything seems to be not quite there. It's always slightly out of focus. And is that the fault of television? Newspapers themselves these days, even major newspapers, God forbid, seem to have agendas which get played out on the front page, so that if people come to be confused about what's going on, there may be a reason for it, and maybe the press is performing some role that it was not intended to do.
I think we make a lot of decisions in the media industry on the assumption that everybody else is as big a junkie as we are. We assume they've seen this event on CNN or they've watched C-SPAN, and so we can't just report what happened. We have to give a take or a spin or something, and so that lends itself to interpretive journalism, and it's a very thin line next to opinion journalism. And I think the way we covered the healthcare debate illustrates the weaknesses in the press. I mean, we were doing major takeouts on the issue long before anybody paid attention, and by the time it got to crunch time on the Hill, the public was making up its mind mostly from advertising from interest groups opposed to the bill. It was never really an educational effort. I think the media has sort of lost its role as sort of a simple conveyor belt of information.
Yep. Senator, as a public official, you have been covered by the press for a long time. Now, out of it, you've been observing both sides. What do you think? Is the press doing something wrong in your view?
Well, I think Ms. Berger put her finger on the problem that's concerned me for years with the press. I opened this program saying I thought we had the best press in the world. I still think that. Every time I go abroad, I'm glad to get back and read the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, all these other good things. But having said that, I do think there is a preoccupation with process to the neglect of substantive policy matters. I'm told by people that have been following politics for a long time in the press that all began with Theodore White back in the early 60s, where he looked at the intricacies of the campaign rather than where the candidate stood on the great public issues. But I think that's a mistake. I agree with the point that Jesse Jackson made here a while ago. We get this new agenda of the Republican Party signed by 300 candidates or sitting members of the Congress. And the question turns on whether that hurts Newt Gingrich or whether it hurts the Republicans or whether it's a clever ploy that weakens the Democrats, rather than to look carefully at what this agenda is. One question I have that I don't know the answer for: how do you increase defense spending and lower taxes and keep the third pledge in that agenda, which is to balance the budget? First place, I think all three of those are ridiculous objectives. Trying to cut taxes in a country that's running a big deficit and to increase defense spending when we already have a military budget that's equal to all the rest of the world combined. But I think some of these questions need to be raised rather than the question of which politician gets helped or hurt by this and what the polls show.
Bill Kristol, your view of the role of the press?
I actually think, I mean, just speaking as a political scientist, which I once was, and not as this is not a partisan comment at all, I think you can make the case that the press is less powerful today than it once was, the mainstream press. The fact is, as we see in these campaigns, if you talk to campaign managers, what they care about is their paid TV above all, and they do believe with some merit that can drown out plenty of negative editorials and even negative news coverage from national news magazines or even from important local newspapers in the state. And if you look at talk radio and other phenomena, you can make the case that, just again, objectively speaking, for better or ill, and with the decline of the networks, the big three's dominance is much less than it used to be on TV. You can make the case that the press is simply a less important player than it was 20 or 30 years ago in American politics.
And yet the politicians still seem to aim to get their 15 seconds or 30 seconds on the evening news. Kevin Phillips?
Well, I have a sense, I think, that the press is less important in a sense as well, because it's now multiplying. There's so many portions of the press that the power of the mass media has probably been slightly diminished. I think it's also been slightly diminished by the soundbite mentality and by the the picayune stuff. And the upshot, to come back to a point that Jesse made, there really should have been examination of that contract historically and in terms of what the Republicans stood for. The same way that when Democrats talk about deficit reduction, people ought to look at the history of the Democratic Party on deficit reduction, which isn't any good either. But the point is they weren't examined, either side.
We've only got a couple of minutes to go. Reverend Jackson.
Two things. The press, now here's the Rush Limbaugh, Falwell, Bob Grant phenomenon, which is another press factor that is a real factor. The other part is the limitation of the press culture. Much of the Republican conservatism is fundamentally driven by race and race fears. And what it is, the crime bill, or Willie Horton, or welfare reform, or any of that, there's still something fundamental. And that's why a Murray, when he drops his theory about genetic superiority, there's an interesting quietness coming from forces that are looking for a reason to set public policy back and away from where it is now.
Marvin,
Meg Greenfield.
I just wanted to defend the honor of the Washington Post editorial page and say we did, as Mr. Crystal knows, attack the contract on precisely those terms. That's all I wanted to do.
And I want to thank Reverend Jackson for making the distinction between, I think when people talk about the media, they tend to lump everything into one, and you can't do that with the proliferation of radio talk show hosts which blur kind of information with entertainment, with bashing Congress. That's not the same thing as
Which makes
ABC.
it so
The networks never blur information and entertainment. They don't have those
No,
news
but
magazines.
the fact is we do have difficulty now distinguishing hard news from soft news. Talk show, no, that seems to be. National Network News started in 1948.
Is that right? Well,
Yes.
What, 30 minutes in 1962. The addition, the good old days, all these voters were sitting around, the press were carefully analyzing every line of the contract with America, and voters were debating
Well,
these issues.
they weren't.
It's fanciful.
No, what is not fanciful.
Father Coughlin was on TV and the radio in the 30s.
Back in the Kennedy School at Harvard, where you once teach,
Which is
there are
fanciful.
many studies which will prove you dead wrong on that. However, we are just about out of time now. And I want to thank all of our
the ultimate
panelists.
authority, the Kennedy School at Harvard.
Right on. I wanted to thank all of our panelists, really. They did a terrific job. Thank you very much. A complicated subject. Thank you all. These public policy forums are co-sponsored by the National Press Club and the George Washington University. I'm Marvin Kalb. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again real soon.
Tonight on C-SPAN,